morning to all of you today. I just wanted to spend a little bit of our time this week kind of introducing a new topic. We're going to be actually discussing new imperialism today. We've been discussing and spending so much time talking about industrialization, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that theme of industrialization as we kind of go into our material today, as we enter into a new phase discussing something called new imperialism. And our handout that we're going to be looking at is this handout called New Imperialism, Religion, Race, and Real Estate. Because what we're going to see is that there's this new push for European powers to conquer, European powers to pursue, European powers to take over and start colonizing parts of the world. And there's going to be a lot of reasons for that. Some of those reasons include religion. They're going to have religious reasons. They're going to have racial reasons. They believe that they're superior. And also real estate. They are going to need land for economic reasons. So let's kind of look at the handout together. It says on our handout, first of all, that there are 4 different reasons for empire in the 19th century. Number 1, the first is a belief in something called nationalism. We've actually talked about nationalism before. We know that nationalism is this sense of pride in your empire, pride in your country. It's the belief that your country is in some way, somehow superior, belief in nationalism. And number 2, there was also a desire for economic wealth. A desire for economic wealth. We also know that in this time period that European countries are interested in expanding their economic wealth. And we're going to kind of see how this plays in to actually themes that we discussed last week of the Industrial Revolution. Number 3, we're also going to see that there was a sense of religious duty. There was a sense of religious duty that Europeans believed that because of Christianity, you might remember that Christianity argues that there is heaven and hell on the line, that heaven for those people who trust in Jesus Christ and hell for those who are outside of this Christian movement. And so there's a sense of religious duty. And number 4, and this is something we have not really yet talked about yet, this is a new idea. There was number 4, a belief that Europeans were actually biologically superior. We'll get into this in just a little bit, but you might remember that there was a super influential book by Charles Darwin, and he believed that there was something called survival of the fittest. Well, white Europeans are going to look at the hierarchy of life and say not just is there obviously some species less evolved than others, but they're going to actually even see that humans are an example, different human societies are an example of this biological evolution. And so we're going to see this. It's a bit of a new idea that Europeans came to believe that they were biologically superior. Now, let's go ahead and first talk about one of the first beliefs, the first reasons for this new imperialism, this second phase, because we've actually talked about a previous phase of imperialism. You might remember that there was that first phase at the end of the 1400s with 1492 to the 1500s, and who were the big winners? Who were the big leaders at that time? Well, that was Spain, and that was Portugal. Remember how the Spanish took over huge portions of North and South America. Remember how Portugal took over Brazil. They took over these coastal areas of Africa and India, creating a trade empire. Well, that was the first wave of imperialism, but now we have a second wave of imperialism that we're talking about now in the 19th century. And nationalism was one of the motivations for this. You might remember that they believed that building an empire was a way for a country to build pride. Building an empire was a way for a country to build pride, that European countries saw themselves in rival relationships with one another. And they thought that one of the best ways for them to demonstrate their superiority, one of the best ways for them to demonstrate that they were stronger, that they were better than the other countries, was to build these empires. And so nation states began to build empires, especially at this time in Africa and Asia. These are parts of the world that had not yet been conquered. Remember that Africa was kind of off limits due to disease. Africa was off limits due to diseases like malaria. But medical progress had come to the point that there was now medication that would help treat malaria. And malaria was no longer a death sentence for Europeans. With this medical innovations, it opened up Africa to something it had not been opened up to previously, which is conquered by white Europeans. The British, it says on our handout, actually had to look for new lands for their empire after they lost something really important in the 1700s. You might remember that the British had a colony with millions of people in it in the end of the 1700s. This colony, inspired by the ideas of the Enlightenment, declared independence, and losing that was devastating to the British. The British had to look for new lands for empire, especially after they lost the 13 colonies. So we actually indirectly are a reason why the British are all the more looking to invest and to investigate other imperial options after they lost the 13 colonies. Also, at this time period, they started what's called a penal colony. A penal colony is another word for a prison colony. In other words, what are you going to do with all of these prisoners? What are you going to do with all these prisoners that you don't want in your own country? Well, let's send them away. And that's what they decided to do. They sent them away all the way to as far as they could think about. In 1788, there was an entire continent which would be used as a prison colony. That would be Australia. And not only did the British expand to places as far away on the other side of the world like Australia, in 1857 they controlled all of India. And that's a big deal because India, what a transition for India. They had been an economic leader. India had been an economic powerhouse, and now India is actually dominated by a small island with a remarkably powerful navy. So they controlled all of India. So the British are doing pretty good. Well, what about other countries? Well, France. Well, think about France. France is kind of in a situation that after you get defeated in a war, you might want to look to flex your muscles. You might want to show what you're made of. You might want to try to make up for an embarrassing loss. And that's exactly what happens to France. France, it says on a handout, actually lost a war called the Franco-Prussian War. This was only from 1870 to 71. And you might remember that this war was over quick, it was humiliating, and this was a war against Germany. It was a war against Germany. You might remember that Germany is, as a country, kind of a new thing, that Germany came to be unified in the end of the 1800s. And one of the most powerful parts of Germany was an area called Prussia. And there was a war between France and Germany. This war did not go well for France. They lost, and they are now kind of looking to make up for that loss. France lost the Franco-Prussian War, which was a humiliating war that they lost against Germany. France wanted to compensate for this humiliation by building empires in two parts of the world. Number one was North Africa. And the area of North Africa that they wanted to conquer, that they wanted to take over, was Algeria. If you look at a map, Algeria is directly south of France. And so they thought that would be a natural place for them to build, a natural place for them to expand. But they're also looking elsewhere. The French, like many Europeans, are intrigued by Asia. And there is a part of Asia that they can conquer. Now, the British have kind of their hands all over China, not directly ever ruling. You might remember there's something called the Opium Wars, where the British were making a ton of money selling to the Chinese people. But there is a part of Asia that the French will have their fingerprints. It's in Southeast Asia. Sometimes it's called Indochina, but it's the modern day country we know as Vietnam. So these are the areas of the world that France begins to flex their muscles. Algeria in North Africa, and Vietnam at this time called French Indochina. Now, there are also new kids on the block, new countries that are looking also to build empire. And that's the thing, like you want to be like all the other countries. And what are all the countries doing that are doing well? Well, they're building empire. Well, you too want to build empire. So two newly unified nations that wanted to build empire, think about this. We've already mentioned one, a country that is brand new in the 1800s, that would be Germany. But there's a second country that's brand new in the 1800s that wants to also build empire, and that would be Italy. These two countries that are two newly unified countries, they want to be empire builders. They want to be like all the other European countries, and so they enter the game. So Germany and Italy, they entered imperialism, it says on your handout, very late. Compared with the British, compared with the French, these are countries we've been talking about with colonies for hundreds of years. The Spanish have started settling in 1492. The British had their colonies, the French had Canada briefly, they had New France. So these countries are not new to this idea of conquering these previous ones, but Germany and Italy certainly were. They entered imperialism very late. Well, what would Italy do? Well, just like France looked just south of them to Africa, Italy does the same thing. And you might remember that north coast of Africa was controlled by an empire in decline. This empire was so in decline that it had a nickname. It was actually called the Sick Man of Europe. That Sick Man of Europe was none other than the Ottoman Empire. Well, directly south of Italy, this North African nation would be taken over. It says Italy would take over the North African nation of Libya. Libya would be taken over by Italy. And Italy would also look to take over another African nation, and they're going to take this briefly. Now, this won't be actually until before World War II that they'll successfully do it. But they'll be really interested in the East African nation of Ethiopia. You might remember Ethiopia as the oldest Christian nation in Africa, and also, actually, of all the nations in Africa, Ethiopia was the only one to resist being conquered until right before World War II. Italy actually invaded Ethiopia more than once, and the first time was actually a humiliating defeat for Italy. The Ethiopians had bought modern guns, the Ethiopians had trained in modern ways, and Italy thought, man, we're just going to roll over the Italians, it's going to be no big deal, and it was actually a devastating loss for the Italians, and really a source of pride that here's an African nation that can and did beat a European nation. And so Italy will have its sights on Ethiopia. It won't actually take it over until the 1930s, leading up to World War II, which is outside of our theme and our discussion for today. But that is something that they would take later in the 1930s. What about Germany? Well, Germany is also looking for empire, and they would take over modern-day Burundi, Tanzania, and Rwanda. These are parts of East Africa today that are very much tied together, especially Burundi and Rwanda. We've talked about Rwanda with the genocide in Rwanda, the cultural tension between the Hutus and the Tutsis, the two tribes there. Well, guess what? In Burundi, the two main tribes in Burundi are the Hutu and the Tutsi as well. And so actually the language in Burundi and the language in Rwanda, they're related languages. They're not identical, but they're definitely related. And if you speak one, you can understand the other. Well, the Germans take over these three East African areas. And it's important to understand what it means when I say they take over. When these countries are taken over by European empires, and if you were to actually go and meet an African and say, hey, did you know that you're part of the German Empire? A lot of these locals would be surprised. They would have not know what you're talking about. They may actually never even have any sort of meaningful contact with a white person their entire life, even though they were supposedly ruled by them. In fact, it says on your handout there'd be very little Germans to move there. Even though if you looked at a map, there'd be a map, it'd be colored and shaded in as a German territory. There'd be very little Germans would actually move there. To give you a sense of how little white people there were there, the entire population of German East Africa, the entire black native population, was about 7.5 million. I mean, that's sizable. That's a significant populated part of this colonial empire. 7.5 million native black Africans lived here. Well, what was the white population? This doesn't just include Germans. Other people would move to do business, not just people from Germany, but we think there was probably only about 10,000 white people in total in that entire region. So a lot of people, villages, agricultural communities would never actually see a white person the entire time that Germany, so-called, was in charge of these areas. And if you were to tell someone, oh, did you know that from 1885 to 1919 you were part of the German East African Empire, a lot of Africans would have no idea what you're talking about, having never seen a white person and never saw an impact. But there were some ways the Germans did impact East Africa. In fact, they want to make money there, and they realized that Rwanda in particular is perfect for growing something that is highly marketable. They worked to develop East Africa by planting, we'll write down, 2 million coffee trees. They planted 2 million coffee trees. And to this day, Rwanda is known for high quality coffee. It's really great. It's wonderful. And the Germans were some of those people who were responsible for introducing coffee there and it doing so well there. Even though coffee grows in Africa, actually a lot of people who grow the coffee, work these coffee fields, don't drink coffee. Coffee is not a popular drink in Rwanda. It's not a popular drink in Kenya. Those parts of Africa tend to be more tea drinkers than coffee drinkers, but it is made to grow, it is grown there to be exported elsewhere. The Germans in East Africa, even though they were there for a short time, Swahili, which is the main language of Tanzania, Kenya, they actually has some German words. For example, the white people brought schools with them, and the word for school in German is virtually the exact same word for school in Swahili. Actually, I was just talking last night to my friend Eliakim, and as I was researching and kind of going over this, I asked him, how do you say school in Swahili? And it turns out it's the exact same word for it in German. And so that is attested to because white Europeans, the Germans, built those first schools. And my friend Eliakim, who speaks Swahili, had never known that story of where that word came from. This Swahili word is actually a German word. So that's Germany. They're involved in East Africa. What about other countries? What about Spain? Well, even though Spain was part of that first wave of imperialism, we talked about it, with like Mexico being taken over, South America taken over. They were part of that first wave of imperialism during the 16th and the 17th century. They were involved in imperialism in the 16th and the 17th centuries. That's true. Though that is true, they did not play a large role in 19th century new imperialism. And that is, again, what we call this topic. We call this topic new imperialism. New imperialism is different than that first wave. That first wave is like Chris Columbus. It's like the Aztecs being taken over. It's the 13 colonies. It's Virginia. It's New France. That's the first wave of imperialism. This second wave of the 19th century, we call it new imperialism, and Spain doesn't really play a role. Now, there is a country that does most definitely play a role, and that country is an Asian country, Japan. And Japan has been flexing its muscles. You might remember that they learned the lesson of modernization. There was a phase in Japanese history called the Meiji Restoration, where they modernized and they industrialized, and one of the things they decided to do is be like Europe, and that means fighting countries to expand their influence. And they go to a war in a conflict called the Sino-Japanese War. And you might remember that this word Sino, S-I-N-O, is an abbreviated reference to a country that we've studied that did not learn the lesson of imperialism, and that is China. So the Sino-Japanese War, this war was fought and they defeated China. And in doing so, they would gain control of a peninsula that has kind of gone back and forth in influence between China and Japan. They gained control of Korea. Okay, so that's a couple countries in particular in our introduction. Now let's look a little bit about motives, and then we'll look at some broad themes, and we'll be done with our day. First of all, cultural and religious motives. Europeans saw themselves as protectors and not invaders. If you would ask Europeans, hey, what gives you the right to do the things you're doing? Isn't it wrong? Aren't you basically invading? Aren't you taking over? Europeans would respond that no, that they weren't invading at all, that they were actually protecting, they were actually helping, they were actually contributing. Europeans, from their mindset, they saw things that they thought were wrong. They saw polygamy, they saw slavery, they saw ritual killings, they saw practices that they thought were culturally backwards, and they thought, it's my responsibility to go to Africa, to go to Asia, to help these people become civilized. They thought, we are actually protectors, we are not invaders. White Europeans also at this time actually felt they were racially superior. They thought they were racially superior. And if I am a superior, then it's my job to rule, to manage people who are not on the same level as I am. And they claimed, Europeans did, that science backed the idea that non-whites were inferior. You might remember we talked a little bit about Darwin earlier today, and that is like a new thing in the 1800s, this idea of evolution. And Europeans said, yes, evolution is true, and they extended that to discuss how it dealt with human societies. They did so in ways that were also kind of examples of pseudoscience, fake science. There was something called phrenology, and this is people who study the size and shape of the human skull. A phrenologist is someone who studied the size and shape of human skull, and they believe that if you look at the skull of someone who is Hispanic, the skull of someone who is black, the skull of someone who's white, that there was clear differences in the shape and the size of our heads, and this indicated to them, to these racist scientists, that science backed up that white people were smarter. They believed that shape and size of European skulls demonstrated that they were more intelligent. That's what they believed. And so there's a chart that kind of, if you look at the chart, it kind of shows you what they thought about different types of people's racial backgrounds. Charles Darwin, you might remember, had argued for a concept that white imperialists are going to expand upon. This concept was called survival of the fittest. Charles Darwin had argued for something called survival of the fittest, and white imperialists said, yes, we agree with that, and we believe we can extend that to discussions of empire. That it's not just survival of the fittest for animals in the jungle, but also for humans as well. And for me to conquer Asia or Africa is just an example that I am in fact part of a more fit people group. Charles Darwin had a super influential book, you might remember. His book that he wrote was called On the Origin of Species. On the Origin of Species. And this book does not really openly endorse imperialism, but the ideas from Origin of Species would be used, and we'll talk about this in a later lecture, would be later used by people in ways that Darwin probably would not have expected fully or endorsed completely, but his book was influential in kind of getting this mindset going. He argued that the fittest species were the only ones who would survive. He argued that the fittest species were the only ones who would survive, and some took his biological theory and applied it to human ethnic groups. So some people took his theory and applied it to human ethnic groups. There's a related idea to this. It's called social Darwinism. And again, Charles Darwin himself did not argue this, but people would take his idea and push that idea forward. Social Darwinism is this belief that whites were biologically superior. It's the belief that whites are biologically superior. And they believed human history indicated that that was true. They said that the spread of US and European power actually demonstrated the superiority of whites. they said, how else can you explain the expansion so quickly and taking over Mexico and South America, North America, Africa, and Asia coming to be taken over? How do you explain a country like China, which had been dominant for thousands of years, now being pushed around by a small island nation like Great Britain? They thought the spread of U.S. and European power demonstrated the superiority of whites. And as a result, colonizers saw it their responsibility to bring civilization, to bring culture, to bring betterment to Asia and Africa. Colonizers introduced their language and their culture. So now let's transition away from science to religious motives. You might remember that Europeans overwhelmingly were Christian. There are some Jews, but they're not going to really be in any leadership in Europe, political leadership. And religious missionaries are going to be huge. You know, as Christians believe that Jesus is the only way to heaven and that there's eternal consequences for those who don't sign up for Christianity, there's huge religious motivations. Missionaries then wanted native people to give up their traditional religion. There's two examples of traditional religion. One is animism. Animism is like when you worship like trees or a mountain or like a sacred field or something like that. They thought that that was wrong, and they also wanted to end ancestor worship. This is where you pray to grandparents, pray to great-great-great-grandparents. They thought that's not going to help you at all. They want to replace animism and ancestor worship with worship of Jesus Christ. Missionaries, it says, set up Western-style education in what was called mission schools. They set up Western-style education in mission schools. And these mission schools are really influential because the future leaders of these countries, when these countries eventually are independent, they're led, not all the time, but many times, by people who got their education from a white person in these mission schools. These missionaries not only introduced modern Western-style education, but they also introduced Western-style medicine. And we actually see a lot of preventable diseases being treated, diagnosed, and dealt with because of this. And actually, in this way, Western missionaries do help average Africans with the introduction of Western-style medicine. And there are things, not only do they want to change you from worshiping a tree or a hill or a mountain, they also want to change you from stopping you worshiping your ancestor, but they also want to end things that they think are wrong. For whatever reasons, there's different people groups that were actually killed in Africa by Africans. People who were albinos were actually often killed and mistreated in Africa. Sometimes twins were mistreated in Africa. But also, even though the British and the Americans had outlawed slavery in various ways, in different ways, it didn't look like white European slavery was in the American South or in Brazil, but slavery was practiced in Africa. And when missionaries came to Africa, they saw black owners owning black slaves. They thought it was wrong. And just like abolitionists fought to end slavery in the United States, just like British abolitionists fought to end slavery in the British Empire, missionaries worked to end slavery and sacrifice. By sacrifice, I mean human sacrifice, because there definitely were examples of African cultures and tribal groups where they would sacrifice humans. So they believe it's their responsibility to spread Christianity, and that means stopping slavery and sacrifice. So with religious motives, some people went believing, yes, we're actually doing this for Christianity. They want to change their religion radically. They want to stop slavery and sacrifice. They set up schools, which is going to be a place where future African leaders will be educated. And they bring medicine, which does bring practical benefit to people. But there's also some economic motives. Some people say, yes, Jesus is great, but Jesus and money is even better. Economic motives, multiple factors. Actually, it's important to remember, entice Europeans to increase their expansion. There's more than one reason. It's not just selfless love of Jesus and for your fellow man, but there's multiple factors. that led to Europeans to increase their expansion. Economic economies, you might remember that in the 1800s, European economies had been transformed, that people were not making stuff in their houses anymore. There's not cottage industries as the number one way that people are making their income. What happened in the 1800s that transformed economies? What happened in the 1800s that changed the way Europeans made money? Well, you might remember that this transformation of the European economies in the 1800s was done by the Industrial Revolution. That there was a movement from the farms to the factories. There was a revolution from making stuff in your home and cottage industries to the mass production of goods. And now that we're in this Industrial Revolution, European economies need new sources for raw materials. I need a place that's going to grow cotton. I need places that's going to grow all these different raw materials that I need. And not only do I need the raw materials, I need somewhere to sell my raw materials to. European economies needed new markets for their manufactured products. Not only do I need the raw materials, I also need a market that I can sell this to. So let's talk about a couple of different companies, and then a summary, and then we'll be done. The first company you should know by name is the British East India Company. They were the first main trading company that allowed the British to control India. This was a corporation that would pretty much come to dominate India, and this would be the company, the British East India Company, that would get the British to begin this colonizing relationship with India. And in the 19th century, you might remember that they grew wealthy by selling to China vast amounts of something that the Chinese leaders did not want, but the British did want to sell. They wanted to make up this trade deficit. You might remember the Chinese didn't want or didn't perceive they needed anything from the British, but they found something that people were really becoming hooked on, and that was opium. It was opium. So that's the British East India Company. They begin the British presence in India. They grow wealthy by selling opium to the Chinese. And then there's also the Dutch East India Company, sometimes referred to as the VOC. And they dominated trade in spices. That's what the Dutch were really interested in. And they would actually take control of all these spice islands in Southeast Asia, which makes up the modern day nation of Indonesia. So that's the Dutch, and we'll kind of revisit them a bit later. So finally, summary of new imperialism in the 19th century. Several factors helped the British become the world's leading economic power. There were several factors that helped the British become the world's leading economic power. The first factor that allowed the British become the world's leading economic power, the British economy was transformed again and took the lead in the Industrial Revolution. This is what helped set up Great Britain in that number one spot, that they took the lead and they in fact developed the Industrial Revolution. There was a second factor that allowed the British to do so well, and there was a series of wars in the continent called the Napoleonic Wars. It's called that because you know who was responsible for those wars? None other than Napoleon. But you might remember that though Napoleon was so talented and did so well for a short amount of time, ultimately Napoleon didn't win, and Britain won a series of wars with France. And that means that their greatest rival is at a disadvantage, and this actually just continues to embolden and enrich the British. Third factor, Britain had a vast and growing empire that provided them with raw materials. The British already had Canada and Australia and parts of Africa. They're just continuing to expand and grow. Britain is taking over India. Tons of raw materials that's going to be used for their factories. In fact, they also have 3 new British colonies that had large amounts of white settlers. They had the 13 colonies. Like the 13 colonies in Canada, majority white people. But the 13 colonies had gained independence. Most parts of the British Empire didn't have a large white population. Like Kenya was owned by the British ultimately, but there's not a lot of white people in Kenya. Uganda was owned by the British. Ultimately, Nigeria owned by the British, but there wasn't a lot of white people there. Same thing with India and Pakistan. But there were three areas that would have a large amount of white people move there. And these settler colonies, these colonies that have a lot of white people settling there, they were important because they provided markets for British manufactured goods. They provided markets for British manufactured goods. In other words, when white people go to these new places in Africa and the Pacific, they want the products that they had back home. And so not only are these colonies supplying you with raw materials, you're making stuff out of those raw materials, and now you're selling it back to where these white people are moving because they want a little piece of home. The three white settler colonies you should know by name are New Zealand. The second white settler colony you should know by name is Australia. And the last white settler colony that you should know by name is South Africa. These are three colonies outside of Europe that had large white populations. In fact, the white population of Australia will pretty much dominate the native people of Australia. The white people of New Zealand will dominate the native people. South Africa's a little different. They're never ever going to dominate numerically like the white people did in Australia and New Zealand, but politically they will. There will be a white minority that will rule the black majority of South Africa. And still to this day, South Africa has the largest percentage of white people, but it is not the majority by any means. So with Britain doing so well, other European nations wanted to challenge Britain's economic lead. Other European countries looked at Great Britain and said, hey, we want a piece of that. We want to do well just like you guys. They wanted to challenge Britain's economic lead. And these nations knew they would have to turn to unconquered parts of Asia, Africa, and the Pacific Islands. These other European countries knew if they wanted to challenge Great Britain, they would have to turn to unconquered parts of the world, unconquered parts of Asia, unconquered parts of Africa, unconquered parts of the Pacific Islands. And so because these are new areas that have never been conquered before, that's why we call this time period New Imperialism. Other countries want to play catch up. New countries like Germany and Italy want to flex their muscles. Countries like Japan want to show that they too have learned the lessons of modernization in this phase of history we call New Imperialism. Europeans looked to science to back up their claims. They looked to religion to encourage their claims, and they looked to economics to pay for their claims. And as we continue to study New Imperialism this week, we'll see how this has practical impacts on the colonizers and the colonized. Until we see each other again, be safe, study hard, take advantage of our time in quarantine. I look forward to seeing you guys tomorrow. Thanks. Bye.